Arrogant rookie officer challenges a black judge's authority. What happens next stuns everyone. The courtroom was quiet as Judge Malcolm Carter, a distinguished black man in his early 50s, entered, his black robe flowing as he took his seat. His reputation preceded him, fair, decisive, and unyielding when it came to the law. He had spent decades serving justice and was a role model in the community, admired for his calm demeanor and sharp intellect. Across the room stood Rookie Officer Becky Langston, a young white woman barely a year into her job as a police officer. Her uniform was crisp, her blonde ponytail tight, and her face wore an expression of haughty confidence. Becky had always been headstrong, convinced that her badge granted her authority over anyone, anywhere. But before we dive into what happens next, I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from today? Drop a comment below. Today, she was in Judge Carter's courtroom to testify in a misdemeanor case. It should have been routine. But Becky, with her arrogance and inexperience, was about to learn a lesson she would never forget. As proceedings began, Judge Carter addressed the room with his usual commanding presence. This court is now in session. Let's begin. The case involved a young black man, Terrence Harris, who had been charged with resisting arrest. Officer Langston had been the arresting officer, claiming that Terrence had been combative during a routine traffic stop. However, Terrence's lawyer argued that the officer had escalated the situation unnecessarily. "Officer Langston," the judge said, his deep voice steady, "please approach the stand." Becky strode confidently to the witness stand, her eyes darting to the judge. She had heard of him, a no-nonsense judge with little patience for dishonesty. Still, she was determined to assert herself. She took her oath and sat down, her posture rigid. The defense attorney began questioning her. "Officer Langston, can you describe the events leading to Mr. Harris's arrest?" Her answers were sharp and defensive, filled with justifications for her actions. She emphasized Terrence's supposed hostility, painting herself as the victim of an unruly suspect. But as the lawyer pressed on, inconsistencies in her story began to emerge. Judge Carter listened intently, his expression unreadable. When the defense attorney finished, he leaned forward, addressing Becky directly. "Officer Langston," he said, "based on the testimony and evidence presented, it seems there are significant discrepancies in your account. Do you care to explain why your body camera footage contradicts your written report?" Becky stiffened. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she said, her tone edging on insolence, "I don't see how my actions are in question. I'm a police officer. I was doing my job." Judge Carter raised an eyebrow. "Your badge grants you authority, Officer Langston, but it does not place you above the law or this court." Her cheeks flushed. "I think you're being unfair," she blurted out. "You don't know what it's like out there on the streets. I have to make split-second decisions. You sit in this courtroom, judging from a safe distance." "Enough!" Judge Carter's voice boomed, silencing the room. He stood, his presence towering. "Officer Langston, your remarks are not only disrespectful but reveal a troubling misunderstanding of your role as an officer of the law. You are here to serve and protect, not to wield power indiscriminately." Becky's mouth opened, but no words came out. The weight of the judge's authority bore down on her, and for the first time she felt small. "Let me remind you," Judge Carter continued, his voice firm but calm, "that this courtroom exists to ensure justice is served fairly. Your actions as an officer are subject to scrutiny because you are entrusted with immense responsibility. When you fail to uphold that responsibility, you not only harm individuals, but erode trust in the system as a whole." The courtroom was silent, the gravity of his words hanging in the air. Becky stared down at her hands, her earlier confidence now replaced with unease. After a moment, Judge Carter sat back down. "Officer Langston, I suggest you reflect on the meaning of justice and the weight of your badge. This court will review the evidence thoroughly, and if it is found that you acted improperly, there will be consequences." The trial resumed, and as more evidence came to light, it became clear that Becky had exaggerated Terrence's actions to justify an overly aggressive arrest. Judge Carter dismissed the charges against Terrence, and the courtroom erupted in murmurs of approval. In the days that followed, Officer Langston faced disciplinary action within the police department. She was required to undergo extensive training on implicit bias and de-escalation techniques. For Judge Carter, it was another day in the fight for justice. For Becky, it was a humbling experience that forced her to confront her own prejudices and arrogance. Years later, Becky would credit that day in Judge Carter's courtroom as the turning point in her career. She became a better officer, one who understood that authority was not about power, but about service, fairness, and respect. Months after the case, Becky Langston found herself reflecting on the events that had led her to that courtroom. The humiliation she had felt under Judge Carter's stern gaze lingered, but so did his words. They echoed in her mind every time she put on her uniform. Your badge grants you authority, but it does not place you above the law. Asterisk. Determined to change, Becky enrolled in advanced training programs and volunteered for community outreach initiatives. She began attending workshops on cultural sensitivity, implicit bias, and de-escalation tactics. It wasn't easy. She had to face parts of herself she had long ignored, but she was determined to become the officer the community deserved. One day, during a police community forum, Becky spotted a familiar face in the crowd, Terrence Harris, the man she had wrongfully arrested. He was speaking about his experience with law enforcement and the impact it had on his life. His words were raw, honest, and filled with a pain Becky had tried to forget. When the forum ended, she approached him cautiously. "Mr. Harris," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know if you remember me, but—" "I remember," he interrupted, his tone cool but not hostile. She nodded, swallowing her pride. "I want to apologize again, not just for what happened that day, but for everything I didn't understand. I've been working to change, and I hope someday I can earn back trust, not just yours, but the community's." Terrence studied her for a moment. Then, to her surprise, he extended his hand. "Apology accepted, but change isn't just about words. Keep doing the work." "I will," Becky promised. Their conversation was brief, but it marked a turning point for both of them. Terrence began collaborating with the police department on community programs, and Becky became one of the most active officers in bridging the gap between law enforcement and the public. Word of Becky's transformation eventually reached Judge Carter. One afternoon, as he prepared for another day in court, his clerk informed him of a visitor. Becky stood in the doorway, her posture no longer arrogant but respectful. "Judge Carter," she began, "I just wanted to thank you. That day in your courtroom, it changed me. I didn't understand what justice really meant until you held me accountable. I'm still learning, but I wanted you to know that your words made a difference." Judge Carter studied her, his sharp eyes softened by a trace of pride. "The pursuit of justice is a lifelong journey, Officer Langston. What matters is that you're walking the path now." As she left his chambers, Becky felt a sense of closure. She had started as a rookie officer driven by arrogance and entitlement, but now she was someone determined to make a genuine difference. And Judge Carter, ever the quiet force of change, smiled to himself. The ripples of justice had reached further than he had ever imagined.